Welcome to the latest Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.
Hello and welcome to Taxing Lyrical, the Evershed Sutherland podcast providing topical conversations for today's tax professionals.
In this episode, we're going to discuss our predictions for the tax announcements in the highly anticipated autumn budget on the 26th of November and how those potential changes may affect our clients. My name is Rebekka Sandwell and I'm a professional support lawyer in the London tax team at Evershed Sutherland. I'm joined today by Beausang and Charlotte Stodell from Evershed Sutherland's London office. In today's podcast, I'll be inviting Paul and Charlie to each make one prediction of a tax change they think is likely to be announced at the budget, one prediction of a change that may be announced but is less likely, and finally one wildcard prediction. Let's start by setting the scene. Paul and Charlie, please could you give your thoughts on the political and economic context for the upcoming budget and how this may impact on the announcements?
Great. Thanks, Rebekka. I'd start by saying, I think it's a really interesting time to be doing this. We've got a whole series of nearly unique circumstances or events with a confluence to today. So, take a look back. The Labour government we have was elected with just over 33% of the vote. That produced a mandate of something like 150 majority. So one of the strongest parliamentary majorities ever, but with a parliamentary party that's nonetheless pretty nervous about each individual constituent's majority. I think that's definitely fueled some of the anxiety, and I think that's been responsible for shaping some of the policy. So if I look back last year at the revolt on welfare, I think that's partially down to it. So I think one thing we possibly were over-optimistic about was the strength of resolve of this government to reform things based on its majority. But I think there's an inherent nervousness because of the individual vulnerability, possibly of each of the Labour MPs. And that position's hardly got better over the last 12 months from an anxiety perspective. So I think that's interesting. The UK's economic position is interesting, to pick the most positive term I can come up with at the moment. And we've got a number of challenges. I think, again, if you look back last year, we can see that I think strategically, very much the plan was to have a tax raising budget year one, get all the bad news out of the way, and have a growth focused agenda, which I think Charlie will talk about shortly in a minute. But very much, therefore, hopefully keeping an even keel thereafter. That really hasn't panned out. So they did have a big tax raising budget, obviously, particularly with the NICs and freezing the increase in the rate bands. That's what actually raised the money. That on school fees, less so possibly. But it hasn't worked in that sense. In other words, the OBR is predicted, I think, to forecast a 30 billion black hole. So no pejorative term included, but old Mother Hubbard needs to go back to the cupboard and find another 30 billion somewhere to get through this year. And again, if you think about the fervile atmosphere of the party itself and where they're coming from, whether or not that will be very carefully selected policies that sort of are consistent with her overall objective and goals and consistent with this growth agenda and everything else, or whether it's a much more realpolitik analysis whereby how can I get these random total of measures to add to 30 billion? I think Charlie and I will explore that possibly later.
Yes, because Paul, I'd agree with you. I think it was clear from the last budget that growth is a top priority of the government and housing is a central part of that strategy. And we know that because she focused on it so clearly. But looking at what has happened since the budget is very interesting. There was a pledge of 1.5 million affordable homes by 2029. And I think it's fair to say that's not on target. That means an average of 300,000 a year. Now, we know last year we got to about 186,000, but there's evidence that planning approvals have since really reduced, only about 39,000 for Q1 in 2025. So, and that's the lowest since 2012. So we're looking at something whereby the plans that they had have not come to fruition. And it's fair to say that what they've done in terms of the housing market is essentially frozen it at the moment. Nothing is happening. Of course, the uncertainty related to the budget is contributing to that. But what's really interesting and key is how they plan to, crack that frozen housing market and to generate growth that, you know, the growth they so want. And I suppose that brings us on to our predictions in the area to sort of talk about how they think, or how we think they might go about doing
I
it.
think that's absolutely right. The only thing I think is interesting is, and tax people love this, there's the concept of the Laffer curve, which is this idea that there's a limit to how much or how high you can put tax rates, and above that you'll either raise the same or even less money overall. And I'm sure Rachel is extremely aware of this. I think over the last 2 years, SDLT receipts have declined. So I think we had 15 billion odd in 22, and that's down to 11.6 billion in 24. And that's at a period of time in which SDLT rates nominally, particularly on residential, have gone very materially up. So very much to Charlie's point, I think there is something here about one of the factors stifling certainly the growth developers bringing forth houses is the difficulty of getting people to buy them. And that's partially down to presumably interest rates and partially down to the general economic malaise, but it's also partially down to stamp duty. And I think that's something, again, they might come to look at shortly.
Thank you very much, both. Some really interesting points there. So moving on to your predictions, what are your picks for the tax changes that are likely to be announced at this year's budget?
Thanks, Rebecca. So I think just for context, again, before we give the specific predictions, it's worth noting there's sort of 2 ways I think broadly she can play this. So she can either come up with her entire sort of pastiche of different measures to raise 3 to 4 billion each. I don't think she's going to do that. Wasn't what she did last year. I think she will look for 2 or 3 measures to raise the lion's share of it, but she will again have a number of other measures which, whilst they don't perhaps raise as much in absolute terms, gives people something to talk about. On that, I think, for example, the Motability Scheme, which I think generates or will cost something like in excess of 3 billion, and which seems to be politically fairly unpopular, that's likely to see some adjustment. And that I think they will get some kudos for. And it also might deflect from some of the criticism they will doubtless get for the big ticket tax rises. But on that, my very likely prediction is, and I think we've all seen discussions on increase in national insurance, increase in tax, and a blended approach to both. I think it's the last one is my gut feel for where she'll go. I think she needs more money than just raising national insurance by, say, 2%, or rather raising income tax by 2% and cutting national insurance by 2%. But I can see her doing a blend. So I can see, for example, her either raising income tax by 3% and cutting national insurance by 2%, or raising income tax by 2% and cutting NICs by 1%. But I think she both needs an absolute increase as well as a bit of a reshaping to move some of the taxation away from earned income and into passive income such as rents and dividends.
It's interesting that you've put that as one of your very likely predictions, given that actually increasing the basic rate of income tax would be the first time the government had done that in 50 years. You actually think that's very likely to happen?
Yeah, I think the one advantage from Rachel's position is if you're as vulnerable as she is at the moment, you've a lot less to lose by taking what would otherwise be quite risky sort of policy gambles at this point.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, and I'm on to my very likely prediction, and I'm going to talk about the stealth tax bombshell, which I think everyone is expecting to come, because I think according to Labour, this does not breach their manifesto promise somehow. But I think it's talking about extending the freeze on personal allowance and higher rate thresholds beyond 2028. We know that they're predicting that by extending it to 2030, they think they will raise another £7 billion, which is not small change in the context of the hole they have to fill. I think it's interesting to look at what they estimated last year, the annual revenue raised by the freeze would be projected to be over £38 billion. So this is something that is an easy fix. People see it as in the future. They don't think they're impacted today. And therefore, I think it's extremely likely, almost inevitable, that this one will come in.
I think that's right. And again, we can talk about the realpolitik. For a government that's meant to be coming up with progressive taxation, freezing allowance and rate bands is amongst the most regressive things you can do in terms of how it taxes people on the wealth distribution curve. But as Charlie said, it's an easy tax to do, and there hasn't been a lot of political revolt against it when they did it last time. Contrast with increasing the NICs, for example, which got far more negative commentary.
Yeah.
Although one might wonder whether there's a bit more backlash this year because so much was made of the fact that they would not do it beyond 2028, and that was a very firm promise.
Yes, it was. It was something that was confirmed in the autumn budget last year. So it is interesting that there's been a lot of discussion about Labour potentially breaching that pre-election promise not to increase income tax NICs, but actually doing this and extending the thresholds. The freeze on the thresholds would actually be a breach of a promise just in the same way.
Agreed.
Albeit not a pre-election promise.
No, but I don't think you get many kudos for breaking a more recent promise.
No.
So on the flip side, I don't really see, in terms of our very likely measures, I don't see what else they can do that's going to get them that amount of money. So I think that's where we are really.
And interestingly, I suppose, for this, the fact of this podcast, it doesn't relate to property.
Yeah. So some good news for our property listeners.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. Could you now let me have your picks for changes that you think may be announced at the budget but are perhaps less likely?
Yeah, I think for this particular prediction, I would go with the council tax bans and the reformation that I think it's probably might almost fall in the very likely bracket, but there definitely will be council tax reform in this budget because, again, it will raise a lot of revenue and help to fill that that deficit that we have. It will also be very popular with the Labour's voters, so I think it's very likely to come in. I think 2 new council tax bans are likely. I think there's also been a lot in the press about band G and band H being the targets for them in particular, so really hitting those higher value homes. It's causing people quite a lot of consternation in many areas, especially in London and the southeast. I think the thing that could be slightly longer term is how, or what people will do in terms of valuing their property, or how that is going to actually operate in practice is a question mark, and how we might have to. At the moment, it's based on 1991 values, and obviously that revaluation task is going to be a much bigger project, and certainly something they'll look at doing. But in terms of that, it's going to be a very tricky process. It's interesting to see how they deal with that in the budget.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, for all of the Labour supporters who are clamouring for a wealth tax, 2 higher rates of bandings for council tax, whilst not actually a wealth tax, is a pretty good proxy at the end of the day. So I think Charlie's absolutely right with that. My very likely, I'm hoping, although I have to declare an interest here, is somewhat less likely. I'm thinking, or I'm hoping it is actually less likely, and that is the mooted tax on LLP profits, which would be painful, obviously.
Do you mean personally, Paul?
I'm thinking of all of us, Charlie. I mean, a more lovable group of people than accountants and lawyers, I'm struggling to imagine. So yes, that's definitely there. The only reason I'm not convinced, even though I think it's on the likely list that she may pause, is it doesn't actually raise that much revenue. So the predictions, I think, even at putting it up by 6%, was only to raise about 2 billion. So it's not actually a huge amount of money given the hole that she faces. And she's got a lot of other sort of noise announcements she can make, such as the Motability Scheme, such as council tax bans. So, also, I think there might be a little bit of a concern as to the impact that will have. So you're talking about hitting the guys who are already paying the most income tax in the economy. And we have seen mobility, we have seen reallocation. We can talk in a minute about growth, which is what's meant to be saving us after all this tax raise has gone through. It's creating the conditions for growth. One area the UK economy which has actually been successful in the last few years is the professional services practices. So do you want to actually sort of mess with that one area is the only thing. Now, this might all just be sort of idle hope on my part, but I would have to accept, I think she's likely to do something. So it might just be another couple of % on the NICs, but that in itself would have an impact.
Because I think you're right, Paul. I think there is potential for professional services firms to restructure, and that must be in the back of their mind when they're thinking about these potential reforms, because
Yeah,
that would be the
100%.
last thing that they would want people to be focusing
Well,
on.
the
Rather
moment,
than,
and I agreed, and the moment you restructure, it opens up the question about where certain business units should be based,
Yeah.
how they should be structured, and you're looking at things which might immediately start impacting on the tax take.
agreed.
If all the professional firms reincorporated to companies and you stop distributing the income out, you'll suddenly find your actual tax take go way, way down. So, you know, I think there are dangers there if they go down that route.
Agreed.
Okay, well, thanks both. Now, for the final section of the podcast, what are your wildcard predictions for changes that could be announced at the budget but are perhaps quite unlikely?
So, and this I accept as a huge dark horse, but you know, it's got a certain amount of historical precedent, and there's a nice bit of sort of defanging in doing this as well, in that you're sort of stealing some of the Tories' clothes rather than what happened for the last 4 years, vice versa. So her big ticket announcement, which might also deflect from other things, would be to announce she was abolishing residential SDLT.
That would be a monumental
It would.
change.
Now, the good news for her is because of the damage she's done with the Laffer curve changes earlier, it would only cost her 11 billion as opposed to 15 billion from 2 years previously. I would have to say I don't think that's going to disappear. So if they do abolish SDLT, they will almost certainly, to my mind, introduce some form of annual property tax in addition. Now, the clever way to do it would probably be just to upgrade all the council tax bands by an amount. I think there would have to be transitional relief if they did this. They'd have to look at anyone who's bought a property, say, in the last 5 years and give them some sort of almost like an offset. So if you've paid stamp over whatever period they determine, you can set that against this extra annual charge. But the advantages of doing this is that you move stamp away from a one-off charge into an annual charge, which means you change hopefully how people view and use property. We'll hopefully see more mobility in the market, which would increase liquidity, which would actually increase overall transactions, might help that whole growth agenda get going. And obviously it would make it very hard for the Tories to criticise, given it's Kemi Badenoch's only newsworthy sort of quote in recent days.
Strong. I think my wildcard prediction is similar, but not quite the same. So I think instead of doing that, I don't think they will do that. Although, no, you know, I've been known to be wrong before, as per the last podcast for the last budget. I think my feel for the wild card is that instead of abolishing it, they will try and reduce the upfront cost. So to Paul's point, to try and improve mobility, to try and unfreeze the frozen market. And I think they'll do that by coming up with some kind of longer threshold for buyers to pay the tax. I think that could also lead to a lot of complexity, which is disappointing. But I think that they might do that. I think they might also increase the SDLT surcharge on second homes and buy to let. And I'm going to put it out there again because I have to. Also putting SDLT on the transfer of shares in property rich companies. But my biggest wildcard prediction of all is that perhaps they may well try to simplify the stamp duty land tax regime so that an ordinary taxpayer can understand it. Because it's fair to say that the complexity and the rules perhaps lead to the biggest misunderstandings in terms of when you're acquiring something.
And obviously there's some sensitivity there, given both the Chancellor and the former deputy head of the party have managed to get their stamp and their understanding of housing licensing laws wrong in the last 12 months. So I think you're absolutely right that if they did that, they would have some justification for saying it's become too complex. I don't think they're going to. I think what's happened with the rates makes it less likely they'll try and extend the ambit of stamp duty, because I think they've seen that by doing that you can actually drive down receipts.
Yeah.
And the last thing they need is another brake on growth.
Yeah.
I dearly hope they don't do the instalment regime, because I think that will, as usual, completely backfire, because a mortgage lender is going to say, well, I can't advance you the upfront money to pay the stamp over time because you might spend it on furniture or something like that, but I will nevertheless on an affordability take it into account in assessing whether you qualify for the loan. So it's one of those ideas where you can look at it and go, I can see why you do it, but actually in practice, I think it's going to be another problem in the housing market. So to the macro point you made, we just need less complexity. We don't need yet more reliefs in some ways. We just need things to stop moving, give the system time to adapt so we can actually get some proper growth going.
Well, I hope you're right, Paul. And I know that your prediction is the one that comes true.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens on the 26th of November. So that concludes today's podcast. Thank you very much, Paul and Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After the budget, look out for our next podcast, where Paul and Charlie will compare their predictions with the actual budget announcements and explore what the key tax changes could mean for our clients. Thank you for listening to Taxing Lyrical. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.